First contact with spirituality. I passed my baccalaureate at the age of 17, in the literary section, with, as an exception in my family, an honors degree. On that day, my father, who was happy because he hugged me and laughed, a rare and exceptional event as it was, told me, "Couldn't you have got the first place as honors degree? It was like a chutney, sweet, spicy, salty, never happy. Could do better." It is at this period that the events accelerated and that the doors of what I could call my spiritual destiny opened. It started with this book unearthed by chance in the library and which had called out to me, The Third Eye of Lobsang Rampa. A classic of the genre when you know it, but for me at the time, a world opened up. Especially when reading the passages where it was about astral travel, decorporation. All of a sudden, my experience of traveling in a pressure cooker 5 years ago came back. So that was it. I remember then devouring Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. I was fascinated, transported into another world, so familiar yet so far from my present reality. Then that summer I unexpectedly encountered the teachings of Omram Mikhail Ivanov. I had to go to Switzerland to look after my cousin's daughter while she went to Greece. But when the train arrives, I see her on the platform. I say to her, "Well, didn't you leave?" "No. I'll explain." In the car, I see her squirming. It's a habit, I thought, for adults to squirm whenever they want to talk about the unusual, as if it were a dirty word or something forbidden. Uncomfortable then, she tells me that her plans have changed at the last minute and that she will have to take me somewhere a bit special. So I spent my first day at the spiritual center in Videl Inata. I noticed that everyone was dressed in white and called each other brother and sister. The meal was vegetarian and was done in silence. In the evening she asked me, "How did you find the day?" "Well, normal. It was nice." "Ah well, it must be your karma." "What is karma?" She handed me a book, The Laws of Cosmic Morality by Omram Mikhail Ivanov, which I devoured in the night. His words flowed like a normal and conforming evidence to the world I carried without recognizing it since little. On the way back from this unusual holiday, a Thursday lunchtime, it was summer, the weather was good and my mother put her meat dish on the table. I said, "No thanks, I've become a vegetarian." As usual, my mother waved her hand as if to say, "It will pass, it's a whim." The next day, the same and so on until Sunday. On Sunday lunchtime, the table was set on the small terrace in front of the kitchen and my mother arrived with a leg of lamb, which she placed in the middle of the table like a holy ritual. I simply saw a corpse bathed in its bloody juice. My father gently motioned for me to bring my plate closer. I politely refused and said, "No thanks, I told you I was a vegetarian now." Ordinarily liberal and tolerant, or so I thought at the time, my father slowly put down his fork, looked me seriously in the eye, and said, "But what is this story?" And then something happened that I will never forget. My father was a well-known academic, one of the 3 Shakespeare specialists in France, a sort of Monsieur le Professeur très erudite, a gentleman who was much appreciated in his milieu, but who was locked into his notion of knowledge, which unfortunately he never left during his lifetime, and which closed our relationship in an unequal match where only the part of me that he agreed to acknowledge would be considered. I answered him with a straight face. "Well, you see, it's simple, you're my father, aren't you?" "Well, I've found my spiritual father." I think if I had put a bomb on the table or shot him with a machine gun it would have had less impact. For the first time in my life I managed to shut him up. He, who always had an answer for everything and who spoke to us as if he were talking to his students, became white, speechless, stunned, dumbfounded. There was a void, a chasm of silence. And it was not a fly that flew or an angel that passed by, but a squadron of fighter planes that had just crossed his sky roaring. I could see that he didn't understand. Up until then I was a pretty quiet kid. Invisible. I was the third and last one. Not a word higher than the other. Not a single teenage crisis, while my brothers and sisters had served them well in terms of escapades. I had nothing. At the time when they were sneaking out to have fun with their friends, I was listening to Chopin, Beethoven, Barbara and Brel. I had grown up in parallel. I was more of a tomboy. My father often made fun of me and called me Georgette. I didn't like playing with dolls and preferred to climb trees. Up there, at least I was quiet. I drew and wrote poems on an old typewriter. Often alone, I had become lonely. As he will say one day. You never know what she's thinking. But the day she speaks or writes. And he had made a gesture with a shaking hand that spoke louder than words. I have never forgotten those words, so rare was it that he spoke seriously about me. It must be the instructions for these pithy formulas, in the form of an enigma, because I have always received messages in this way, drops that fall one by one, like little pebbles, like the little thumb's treasure hunt, peppered over the years to help me move forward. And it has been a long, long road to freeing the living word. Yes, we were in two different worlds that clashed. And that lasted a lifetime. I had just planted a bomb as calmly and serenely as if I had planted a flower. By taking the transcendental route, I was making my way, my route, and I was getting out of the way. They had thought of everything but that. I was making my way not through the door or the window, too easy, but through the oblique corridor of the invisible and the transcendent. As far as religion was concerned, my parents must have felt that they had done their duty. We had gone to catechism, and we went to Mass. But there too, I was thinking backwards. I wanted to be a priest, not a nun. I wanted to say Mass, not watch it. Bad luck, I was neither in the right body nor with the right codes. During Mass, when everyone else had to bow their heads, I raised my head because I wanted to see, know, understand, and know what the priest was doing and not follow blindly like a sheep. I was quickly disappointed. I didn't like the tone and the rituals, which seemed to me to be so rigid. I was embarrassed too. You had to turn to your neighbor and kiss him. I didn't like being forced. Like the day before my solemn communion, I had to confess one by one, alone in front of a stranger, who asked me in a honeyed tone of voice, which freaked me out, if I had done anything stupid. I couldn't think of anything very substantial to tell him, and the ones I had in mind were not something I could admit to a stranger out of the blue. I found it stupid and violent. A rape of the conscience to obtain a certificate of whiteness before the ceremony. I didn't dare or have the guts to object and leave. I pretended, telling a lie to make him happy and to get out of it faster. It was horrible, artificial and false. However, I had a religious cousin and my parents had met a priest in the mountains with whom we had a really good time. Priests also came to the house of my parents. But I watched it from a distance without really being touched. It was the world of adults, of others, that I looked at through my spyglass from the depths of my own hiding place. The only good times I had were with my maternal grandmother and when we went on holiday to the Pyrenees. I would spend long hours alone by a stream or climbing a few peaks and eating blueberries on the way. I think I got a taste for the real and the authentic in those moments, and that laid the foundations for my path in search of God. With my grandmother it was different. She was a Parisian at heart, very coquettish, and with her you could do things that were forbidden at home, like staying up late, watching television and drinking Fanta full of dyes. One day, on the way home by train, I found myself sitting next to a strange character. I must have been 14 or 15 years old. He explained to me that he was a monk. He was dressed in a kind of white sheet instead of trousers, had a shaved head with a little tail of hair on top of his head and wore sandals without socks like monks wear. I thought it was very ugly and out of place. He was desperate for me to accept his cookies. I didn't want them. I was told not to talk to anyone, let alone accept anything. I remember how I was stuck with my little bag, very stilted. Something deep inside me wanted to do it, but I had been trained to be afraid. Without knowing it, I had just met a devotee of Krishna for the first time. Looking back, the memory of the events that were sown on my path like little pebbles that would lead me little by little to my final goal. Incidentally, this was the second time that Krishna came into my life. In the summer of the baccalaureate, my mother decided, without consulting me, to enroll me in a piano class at the conservatory. She had organized everything, and had even made an appointment for a private lesson with the teacher. She was investing in my future. For once, I was neither for nor against it. In fact, as a child I wanted to be a dancer, but my mother had decided otherwise. One day she said, "Your sister will dance and you will play the piano." That's how it was. That was it. So at the age of 6 I started lessons with Mademoiselle Perron, a former pupil of Alfred Cortot. She liked me. She told my grandmother that I was gifted. She was kind. She didn't have any children, so I think she practiced a bit with me. She always sent me to the bakery for a chocolate roll before the lesson. We'd have a hot chocolate. Then she would polish her taps, which shone as if they were brand new, while I finished swallowing my snack, quite happy with this privileged attention, a personal interlude in the middle of a world of indifference. Either my mother would come and get me, shouting "Quick, quick," or I would have to run to catch the bus. This made the missus grumble and she didn't understand why my mother was always in such a hurry and stressed. When I was in the 8th grade, she told my grandmother that she wanted to go to Paris to introduce me to a well-known teacher she knew. Life decided otherwise. She died in her sleep a few months later. No more lessons and little attentions. So I hadn't touched a piano for 5 years when my mother entered me in the conservatory entrance exam to enter the graduation class. On the program, a Beethoven sonata and Messiaen's Les Oiseaux. I passed. Several years of intensive practice followed, always with the same scenario and comments. The day before the exams, everyone said, "Oh, you, really, there will be no problem. You are so talented, sensitive, etc. We don't worry about you." And on the day, there was no one left. I was broken down, liquefied. Just hearing my name and walking to the piano drained what little confidence I had. With sweaty hands and a racing heart, my mind wandered everywhere but where it belonged, focused on the music. So I failed repeatedly despite intensive training for up to 10 hours a day. The highlight was when I tried to enter the upper class. I had been preparing for over a year. It was a 14-page piece by Schumann. Knowing it by heart, I felt technically ready. I wanted revenge and to succeed. I had worked so hard. I had been talking about it for months and my parents were tired of the endless hours spent in the living room in front of the piano 7 days a week, from morning till night. The day before the big day, my father called me into his office and took a little medal out of his pocket and said, "This is the medal of the Blessed Virgin, it belonged to my mother. I'll lend it to you for your test tomorrow." It was touching, probably very exceptional for him, always so modest, but largely insufficient for me. He was always absent and entrusted my fate to the Blessed Virgin as one would light a candle in desperate cases. I said thank you to him with the impression that I would always be missing something and that this medal was not really the solution. I would have much preferred him to come with me, to take time, to listen to me or advise me. But he was always busy working for others, his conferences, his articles, his students, and I was living my life and my challenges alone. So I was going to this competition alone. My mother wasn't the type to travel for her children either, even though she hadn't worked for a few years. She was on her cloud, in her own world. She was a painter, a student of Marcel Marceau, but she had to give up her career and a promising offer to tour the United States, both because she was pregnant with me and also to follow my father to the city where the university offered him an associate professorship. By bowing to the king on the chessboard of her life, the queen lost her trajectory and we, in turn a mere pawn, bishop, knight, or rook, tried to play our game in spite of her, and then very quickly, as soon as we could, without her. The hall was large. The competition was open to the public, with a panel of judges in the front row. I was stunned. My turn came. I found myself at the piano, in front of this old adversary, for a battle suffered rather than desired. I started. The first page ran slowly through my head. As I mentally turned the page to the next one, another dimension suddenly appeared, like a split. I was sitting there but elsewhere. I felt that my fingers were blocked, as if paralyzed. I could only observe the situation, powerless. I was desperately fighting against this force that prevented me from playing properly. I said to myself, "No, not now. Not now." I was living a nightmare in slow motion. I felt like I was rowing. Then I heard, "It's your karma." I could hear, but it didn't change anything in my situation. I was still sitting there in front of that piano, in front of a room full of people. My fingers didn't answer me anymore and I still had 13 pages to play. Playing, it was like a dirty word at the antipode of my reality. Nothing funny. Playing, we didn't play at home. It was frowned upon, a pure waste of time. We had to work instead, that was good. There we were recognized. Idle daydreaming was largely combated with all sorts of to-do lists, notes left on the kitchen table, while they went off to play their lives. Playing was like sunbathing under the hot sun, lying on the beach by the sea, for us an unknown delight at the time. We only went to the mountains, to make an effort. For my mother, the sea was for lazy people who wasted their time, a sacrilege. It was for losers, fat people, ugly people, incompetents, the others, those uncultured people, whom she treated with arrogance and contempt, so much so that she had built up a rigid and artificial conception of the superiority of the intellectual caste. At the moment my senses were heightened tenfold. I was drowning in shame, powerlessness, and humiliation. I was in the middle of an ordeal, dragging Schumann to the pillory, slaughtered. Finally, after a moment that seemed like an eternity, I managed to throw out the last chord like a shipwrecked man coming ashore after being shaken and thrown out of his ship by the storm. I ran away with my head down, picking up this pithy sentence from one of the jury members. "Perhaps you should learn to play before you come." Following this bitter failure, I decided to stop playing the piano and to enroll in a musicology university to take the Dukin license, while doing chamber music. During this time, and in parallel, I continued my little spiritual adventure with Master Ivanov. We used to meet at each other's houses with a few brothers and sisters from the surrounding area who were also in favor of his teaching. A vegetarian Indian restaurant had just opened in the city. Curious to try it, we went there. The smell of spices and curry was delicious. A dream for the eyes and the taste buds. On the wall, magnificent paintings. One of them particularly caught my eye, two figures, one golden and the other blue. One at the foot of a tree with his arms in the sky and the other sitting on a branch in the tree. I remember asking, "Who is that blue character on the board over there?" I don't remember the answer, but I later found out that this painting depicted the golden avatar Sri Caitanya, who in a burning fever of love separation, was wandering in the forest, desperately looking for his blue Krishna, who suddenly appeared to him, sitting on the branch of an Ashoka tree. I was 18 years old and for the third time Krishna was waving at me in life. A few years later in September 1986, I was with my mother in the kitchen and I heard her giggling as she commented on the front page of the local newspaper. "Look at that. The guru of the Hare Krishna sect left with the cash box. I hope you never set foot in it." I looked at the article and after reading it, quietly told her, "Well, yes, I'm going to go and see." She was disconcerted, not knowing how to react. She had unconsciously opened a door for me. So our parents, like all others, are put in place and in power to guide us and accomplish what is to be. Even those who stand in our way unknowingly reinforce our goals. Obstacles and failures alike forge our determination to make it even stronger. We come into the world with a clear roadmap and our choices are guided by the obligations of our karma on one hand and our free will on the other, informed by our past and present experience. So I went to this community to spend the day. I didn't find anything exceptional that would give me desire to go further at that time. I was shocked by the waste of food people were throwing at each other. But I was touched by the genuine and sincere smile a devout girl gave me. And that was all. I was 21 years old, and for the fourth time Krishna was again coming close to my life. On December 24, 1986, I decided to take the night train to Frejus to spend a few days at the Bonfin Spiritual Center. In the early hours of the morning, we were approaching St. Raphael. The day had just begun, when I saw a large white cross in the window in the already blue sky. This thought came to me. The Master has just left. Indeed, born in 1900, Amram Mikhail Ivanov left this world on Christmas Day, December 25, 1986. I had just lost the one who had carried and inspired me for 5 years. The next 2 years were to be an intense inner ascension. Meditations and readings will occupy most of my time. I would only go out to give piano lessons and go to university. I tried to get up early to practice meditation in front of the sun. I was learning and experimenting a lot, also very self-contained. I used to stay in silence for hours, decanting. One day I had this strange intuition. You have to train yourself not to eat, because one day you will starve. Where did this come from? I don't know, but decades later, I understand that something is hovering over humanity and we must prepare ourselves to live naturally in sobriety and be content with little without this creating tensions. This life is a passage, a training in a given time and space, to love and live better. Then, after 7 years of enthusiasm and expansion within this teaching, I began to lose steam, to lose myself. The taste disappeared little by little. The practice became automatic, lifeless, and soulless. I clung to the memory of this impulse that I felt was disappearing without being able to bring it back or revive it. It was a drama. I felt drained and disconnected from inside, with no reference point outside. A long descent into hell was beginning. Icarus had flown towards the sun, but his wings had been burnt and he plunged straight down into the black abyss of the earth. I didn't accept living here. I wanted so much to leave, not to live on earth but elsewhere. I was there without being there. I wasn't living, I was pretending and was emptying myself. I was locked up in an invisible bubble, losing weight. I had the feeling every mouthful swallowed was pinning me down. Fasting, on the other hand, made me feel like I was escaping. The first year I didn't notice it, but then I started to receive reflections from people that I brushed aside. As far as backhandedness and self-denial are concerned, I had been taught well, and so I followed my parents' example on this point, like a good student. I watched this descent, powerless, in front of my piano, isolated, in silence, without being able to talk about it with anyone. The dialogue with my parents was reduced to pretending to be okay in order to have peace. A gap separated us. Or rather a great canyon. I was the Indian and they were the soldiers. They easily ridiculed what was sacred to me, and from the height of their intellectuality and academic erudition, they put my interests in the subcategory of trash and refuse. One could not be more opposed. It's quite simple. What interested me bored them, and vice versa. What is night for some is day for others. One day I broke down. I called them for help by default because I couldn't stand the emptiness any longer. That was in February 1988. They took me back and I lost everything, independence and flat, even my bank account. The bird was once again a prisoner of this golden cage from which it had chosen to escape to fly in search of its own sky elsewhere, but the storm had brought it back to the starting point. Another bitter failure that would shave my illusions and ego forever. I was struggling in this dark passage with two difficulties, the inner one, coming from my own doubts and desert crossing, and the outer one, of surviving in a seemingly good but deeply toxic family where I was neither seen nor recognized as who I was but only as who I had to be, in their image. You don't come out of this kind of fight unscathed. I lost some feathers. My health and my morale too. One day I was naive enough to confide in my mother that I was hearing voices. I was naively trying to communicate to her a little of this subtle world I so often inhabited and had so much difficulty in taming, understanding, but that I wanted so much to discover, so much this reality seemed more natural to me than the visible world in which I was forced to function. It must be said that life always finds the best solutions to try to cure us of our ignorance. What could be better than to plunge a soul into an earth family, Father Virgin and Mother Bull, to try to cure this refusal of incarnation? A very curious alchemy, but frighteningly effective. Meeting of opposites to work on balance. For the time being my mother jumped on her phone to call the doctor and tell him, "Doctor, my daughter has hallucinations, she hears voices." He immediately concluded that I was schizophrenic and, given my weight, anorexic. With two new labels, I struggled like a trapped animal and my refusal to swallow anything only grew. Now they were pressuring me to go on medication and chemical treatment. It was a nightmare. I couldn't cope. My father was always away, and when he was there we would clash fiercely in discussions where he would always end up telling me, "But you think and reflect too much. You talk and ask questions that one only asks when one is old, not when one is young." And my mother sighed in dismay. "But what are we going to do with you?" I was giving them a problem. They were at a loss. As much as they had not foreseen my birth, they did not know how to accompany my life. I was alone. It was painful and difficult,